a lot of time we address white supremacy and anti-racism through reason, through principles, through ideas. I believe you're reading Kindy's work, and we do discussions and we have book groups, and this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. I teach. I love engaging on that level. And there's nothing wrong with it, but I think we also need to recognize that we're trying to teach our brains to think better about race, we sort of ignore the fact that white supremacy actually lives not only in our brain, but it lives in our bodies. And that our bodies have a form of knowledge that's different from our cognitive knowledge. And if you think back over your life, you've probably noticed, bodies tell us they're constantly communicating with us. And they do that in a variety of ways, maybe through constriction or expansion, sometimes through pain, sometimes through feeling ease, sometimes there's energy, right? Sometimes there's numbness. And people will tell us that often what is stored in our bodies are actually wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. And so that's sort of where I'd like to begin, is that, I want us to have an opportunity to look to our bodies and to just notice and to feel into our bodies and see what they might have to say to us. And then we'll do a practice together, and then we'll follow it up. I'll give you a little bit of input on what some scholars are saying about the relationship between white supremacy and racism and bodies. And then we'll have some time for discussion around that. All right. So before we kind of delve into our embodied exercise, I want to stop and say, I'll be leading you through this exercise. And so I just right now invite you to find some place where you can sit comfortably while also being sort of upright. So you don't want to be sort of slumped over. So just making sure that you're comfortable but upright. If at any point, as I'm leading you through this exercise, you feel overwhelmed, you feel yourself becoming anxious, I invite you to do what you need to do. You can either slow down, you can come back to your breath. You can even, if you have your eyes closed, you can open up your eyes. You can reorient yourself to the room. This is your practice, and I'm offering this for you. So please listen to and respond to what your body is saying. I'm also going to just invite you, if you'd like at this time, you can turn off your video, or if you feel comfortable leaving your video on, you can leave it on. This is really your decision right now, but we'll sort of do this embodiment practice together, and then when we're finished, I'll invite you, if you've turned off your video, you can turn it back on, and we'll come back and we'll kind of discuss it. I invite all of you, wherever you're sitting, to just take a moment, and you can close your eyes if that feels comfortable to you. You can also keep your eyes open and just have them sort of softly downcast. And I invite you to sit and know you're sitting. So what I mean here is to basically just sit and be attentive to any sensations that let you know that you are sitting right here. So notice any places you might feel tightness or constriction. Notice any places you feel openness. And instead of thinking about sitting, I invite you just to feel into sitting. So now I invite you just to bring your attention to your breath, and just notice your breath as it travels in and out of your body. Where do you feel your breath the most? So perhaps you feel it as your chest rises and falls. Maybe you feel it in your nose or some other place. And I just invite you to gently bring your attention to wherever you feel your breath the most prominently. And to simply observe it. There's no need to alter your breath. Just observe your inhales and your exhales. See if you can follow one complete inhale from beginning to end. And then one complete exhale from beginning to end. And as other thoughts come or go, there's no judgment. That's what the brain does, it thinks. So just notice that you're caught up in thinking and bring your attention gently back to your breath. Now I invite you to take your attention and bring them to your feet. So maybe you notice some sensations you might be feeling in your feet. If you don't feel any sensations in your feet, you could always wiggle your toes or move your feet in some way. I want you to just sense the ground beneath your feet supporting you. And can you just allow the ground to offer you its support? I now invite you to bring your attention to the sensations of your seat sitting and your back pressing against whatever you're sitting on. And again, can you allow the chair to support you? So as the chair offers you its support, can you simply accept that support? I now invite you just to notice the place in your body where you feel the most grounded. Maybe it's your feet, perhaps it's your seat or your back, just the place where you feel the most rooted and the most grounded. And imagine that part of your body just melting a few more inches into the chair, into the floor. Again, just allowing yourself to accept the support of both the chair and the floor. Now I invite you to bring to mind a person, a pet, or a place where you feel safe and secure. And as you bring this person or pet or place to mind, see if you can just picture them in front of you. So see that person or pet in front of you, look into their eyes, or if you're in a place, look at your surroundings and truly notice what's around you. And just let yourself experience the safety and security of this person, this pet, this place. Accept the love and regard that you might feel. Now, I'd like you just to start to check in with your body. We'll start with your shoulders. How do your shoulders feel? Are they relaxed? Are they constricted? And then we'll come up to your face. Check in with your neck, your jaw, your forehead. Are they relaxed or constricted? And then we'll check in with your major joints. So we'll check in with your elbows, with your wrists, with your hips, with your knees, with your ankles. And just see what you notice. Is there any relaxation there? Is there constriction? Is there tension? Is there vibration? And let's check in with your back and your torso, your legs as a whole, your feet. Just see what you notice. What sensations are here right now? Now, I want you to imagine that the comforting person or place or pet is gone, but instead, there's an angry stranger standing right in front of you. And the stranger's arms are crossed and they are glaring at you silently. And you look into the stranger's eyes, hoping that his or her expression will soften, but it remains unchanged. And not only that, the stranger is starting to approach you and move closer to you. Now, I want you to check in with your body again. We'll start with your shoulders. How do they feel? Are they relaxed, constricted? Let's go up to your face. Let's check in with your neck and your jaw and your forehead. What sensations do you notice? Do you see any tension or relaxation? Let's check in with your joints. We'll go down to your elbows and your wrists, maybe your hips and your knees, your ankles, your shoulders. What do you notice as you picture this angry stranger in front of you walking towards you? Now, how about your back or your torso? Maybe your legs as a whole. Gently, one by one, feel into all the places in your body and notice where you might feel constriction. Notice if there's any relaxation or ease. Just let your attention linger on each spot that calls for your attention. And if there's some place where you feel the most constriction, maybe that's sort of calling out to you, you can actually take your hand and put your hand over that spot. Or you could simply stay where you are. Just noticing your body as this angry stranger glares at you. Now send that stranger away and bring back that comforting person, pet, place, and just take a few deep breaths. And for several breaths, just relax in the safety of this person, this place, this pet. Get back in touch with the seat and the chair supporting you. And move your attention back to your body and just sense, again, what might have shifted. Where you feel softness or openness, or where you still might feel tension or constriction. Now I invite all of us just to take a few deep breaths together. Breathing in through the nose, you can breathe out either through the mouth or through your nose. Some deep cleansing breaths. And then if you had your eyes closed, you can open your eyes and sort of orient to the space around you. So just look around. If you're sitting in a room, you can look around the room. And if you can, try to notice something that you find pleasing, some place where your eyes just want to rest. And just allow your eyes to rest there briefly, just taking in whatever seems to be pleasing in the room. And once you've found that thing that's pleasing, you can just come back to this space. So I'm going to draw a lot on the work of Resmaa Menakem. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's written a book called My Grandmother's Hands. And if you all are interested in book studies, I would recommend this one. Oh, yay! There it is. So, and if you've read this book, some of this will sound familiar, but I really want to highlight some of what he says, because I think it's, he really highlights the embodied dimension of white supremacy. And he has a theory around it that I'd like to just expose you to and kind of get your feedback on. Because I think it's really important. And I think it gives us insight into some of the ways that our bodies might respond, particularly not only when we're doing anti-racism work, but even when we're just encountering other bodies of people of color, other white bodies, what is happening within us. And so he says that part of the work that we have to do around white supremacy is noticing when we're open, noticing when our body constricts, noticing when we're settled, noticing when we get activated, noticing when we have a pain or a response or a fight response or a flight response, and noticing when we basically feel relaxed and at ease. Because he says, that white body supremacy or white supremacy lives in our bodies, right? And so you guys have probably been studying many of the false images and concepts that, white supremacy has created about people of color. But white supremacy also creates what he calls a felt sense in our bodies. It has created a bodily reaction. It doesn't create the same bodily reaction in all of us. We have very different bodies. But he would say there are some generalizations we can make about the ways that white supremacy has created these embodied reactions. So Resmaa himself is an African-American male. And he says, many Black bodies just don't feel settled around white bodies, period. And it's not you or us or anything. It's basically, there's a long, brutal history of enslavement and subjugation. There's been racial profiling. There's been murder by police, exoneration of folks who've killed Black folks, right? And then there's been just the habitual grind that people of color experience every day, the disregard, the discrimination, the disrespect, the over-policing, the microaggressions. We could go on and on. He also says that basically that the response, the embodied response that Black people and people of color have to white bodies also really contributes to sort of a lot of health conditions, whether it be increased mental health conditions, diabetes, obesity, other health maladies, and it gets played out on the bodies of Black people. So it can get played out in hate and self-repulsion, within the Black community, and colorism and things like this, right? So, but Resmaa also says that white bodies also have responses that we need to be attentive to. And for him, he says that many white bodies, when they experience an unknown Black body, have an immediate, and this is his words, an immediately, seemingly out of the blue, fight, flee, or freeze response. So what does that mean? Basically, white bodies automatically constrict the part of their brain responsible for processing danger, the more primitive part of the brain. It goes on high alert. And sometimes this can be triggered even by the presence of a Black body. And sometimes it can even be triggered by the mention of race or white supremacy or white body supremacy or something like that. And so he has studied this, and basically he says, well, why? Why is it the case, right? That, for instance, he will say, when I walk down the street, that women grab their purses and put them on the other side of their bodies. He said, why is it that a taxi cab drives past me and picks up the white person down the street? Like, why do white bodies constrict in the presence of an unknown Black body? And he argues that this is actually the result of intergenerational trauma that's been passed down through generations. So what does he mean by that? And for those of you who are familiar with trauma, I apologize. I'm going to do just a very brief overview, much too simplistic, but I want to just give you a sense of what he's talking about here and why we might be basically having involuntary responses that we don't even understand. And he says that, so basically, all of our sensory input, all of our information has to pass through this reptilian part of the brain before it gets to our thinking brain. Okay, so when there's a real or imagined danger, that reptilian, he calls it the lizard part of our brain, it shortcuts that information, right, from even going to our thinking brain until it's assessed whether the situation is dangerous. And if it's dangerous or life-threatening, this part of our brain says, okay, you either have to fight, flee, or freeze, right? So think about if you put your hand on a hot stove, your hand is off that stove, and then your thinking brain is like, oh yeah, wait, what happened? That stove must have been on, right? But you react before you even have a chance to think about it. So that's that lizard part of the brain, right? So whether something is dangerous, but whether something is dangerous or not, doesn't actually refer to whether it's actually life-threatening. It just has to be perceived as dangerous. And if something is perceived as dangerous from the body's perspective, it feels unsafe, right? And it will do almost anything to regain or recover that sense of safety. So this is important because basically we know that throughout US history, white bodies have colonized and murdered Black and Native bodies. And of course, this is going to be traumatic for Black or Native bodies. So it makes sense that Black bodies would constrict in the presence of white bodies. This makes sense, right? But I think what Resmaa offers us is he says, wait, before the US was even the US, powerful white bodies in the continent of Europe also colonized, oppressed, brutalized, murdered less powerful white bodies. He talks about the fact that like torture was an official instrument of the English government. And he's like, when you basically recognize that people were witnessing torture all around them as a punishment for crime, it's not hard to understand why so many people would flee from England to the US, right? Because actually fleeing is one of those three responses to trauma, right? You're gonna fight, you're gonna flee, or you're gonna freeze, right? So it's not hard to understand why people fled. They experienced and witnessed trauma all around them. And so basically he's kind of saying we all have this traumatic history. And trauma or trauma responses, right? They're an effective tool for safety and survival. It's basically our body's protective response to an event to say, this event is dangerous, you need to respond, right? So it's a protective response. But we now know that trauma can be passed down from generation to generation. So in some ways, trauma can be passed down through systems and institutions, but trauma can be passed down through our genes. Because basically when we experience trauma, we now know it actually affects our DNA and it can get passed to our subsequent generations. And so this is what we refer to as intergenerational trauma. So trauma that's been passed over generations. So basically he's sort of arguing that, you know, the trauma that white people experienced, first, it got played out against each other, right? So when people fled from England, they actually had some pretty brutal and torturous punishments for those who were deemed heretics, if any of you know your church history. But that generations of white supremacy have basically first got played out on the bodies of white people, and then white people played out these traumatic retentions or responses on the bodies of Black people. So how does this sort of relate? Well, let's go to today. So we now know, again, when two unfamiliar bodies first encounter one another, each body tries to discern whether or not that other body is safe, right? Safe or dangerous. This is a tool for survival. And so it scans all these different things like size, clothing, how fast is this person moving, what's the expression on this person's face. But one shortcut that the body uses is that it asks, how closely does this body match my body? And so it's not a surprise that white bodies relax in the presence of white bodies and constrict in the presence of Black bodies, and vice versa. Why? Because, and you've all been reading about this, generations of white supremacy have created notions and concepts of the Black body, that the Black body is dangerous, that it's impervious to pain, that it's strong and resilient, that it's hypersexual, that it's unattractive, that it needs to be controlled. Resmaa calls these nonverbal sensations. And we all know cognitively that these are untrue. But I'm going to use his words here. Bodies don't care what's rational or possible or true. Bodies just want safety. And they don't distinguish between an imaginary threat or a real threat. Think about when you're watching a movie and you jump in your seat when something happens on the screen. It didn't actually happen to you, but you can't tell the difference, because bodies have been conditioned to fight or flee or freeze in the presence of danger. The difference, though, is that when white bodies constrict, that white bodies have then basically instituted widespread formalized practices and institutions to control this constriction. So we have these widespread practices that reinforce this white supremacy that we also know is patently untrue. So basically, he says there's been a confusion of fear with danger, of comfort with safety, particularly among white people. So when a white body might constrict in the presence of an unknown Black body, whether or not an actual threat exists, it may then lash out at this Black body in what it thinks is necessary self-protection. And this grants legitimacy for white bodies and police bodies to kill Black bodies, even unarmed Black bodies, because they feared for their life. But what he says is they actually did fear. They constricted. They felt afraid, and they didn't notice it. They were not aware of it. And so basically it gets played out, because the thing about trauma is it gets enacted very quickly, right? Think of the hand on the stove. Like it happens very quickly. And so part of what we need to do in our embodied awareness is to notice. So we need to start to notice. When we did that, that embodied exercise together, when we saw the stranger, we had a juxtaposition of being settled, and then we had something that could have been a little bit threatening, not even a lot threatening, but a little bit threatening, right? And we had a moment to feel into those sensations and to ask ourselves, wait a second, what is different here, right? Can I notice what is happening, where my body starts to constrict, what's going on here? And can I be attentive to that, right? And then can I compare that with those times when I feel more settled? So he was saying, basically he argues that like this process of noticing, right? And being able to ground and center when we notice that we're constricting or feeling fearful or activated is absolutely crucial to any work we do around race. And not only the work we do around race, how we are in the world, right? Because we need to be able to practice this and embody this if we're going to be able to talk about and to basically rail against the standards of white supremacy, because we're going to be talking and we're going to be in painful situations and situations that don't feel good, where our bodies are going to have reactions. And so can we, A, notice when this happens, and then B, be able to settle our bodies so that we can disrupt white supremacy? Now, here's two things I want to say though. First of all, settling our body is not the same as healing. And this is, oh goodness, that's thunder if you can hear that. We're in the middle of a storm, but healing is different. That we need to be able to settle to be open to healing, but that settling and healing are not necessarily the same thing. And this is where I think the importance of spiritual practices comes in, right? So A, can we notice when we are constricted, when we are fearful, when we might feel activated, right? Can we settle our body? And then can we be open to the presence of the spirit to heal these intergenerational wounds that have basically been with our population probably since we've been human, right? So that's one thing that I want to bring to this, is sort of A, can we learn to settle, but B, can we also settle so that we can be open to this larger healing? And then B, something else he talks about is that healing is not a singular endeavor, that healing occurs in community, and that settled bodies help other bodies to settle. And that many of the things that we do when we are church together are actually some of the things that psychology would recommend in terms of harmonizing bodies and healing bodies. Things like singing together and humming together. If you're in a yoga class, things like oming together, washing people's feet. These are things that actually allow our bodies to settle and allow there to be harmonization among people and healing to begin to occur. So I think there's this really interesting dialogue and intersection, right, between this work that people are doing around, again, the relationship of embodiment, white supremacy, and racism. But I also think that we as religious people and people that call upon something greater than ourselves also have something to offer this really unique dialogue that's going on. So I'm going to stop there. I've talked a lot, and see if there's any comments or questions at this point.
It reminds me of a piece of research I read a number of years ago, where they, at a college, they had problems with crows. And so they decided to turn it into some kind of somebody's doctoral thesis, you know, kind of thing. So they had a man with a big hat walk through the area and then fire off a shotgun. And of course, the crows immediately took off. And what they had observed is that there's always a set of crows, the most skittish are sort of like the guard dogs. They, as soon as they see something or hear something, then they give a screech, and that's the signal for everybody to take off. So of course, what they found out is every time this man walked back and forth in the path with his hat on, of course, they all scattered. The crazy thing was that 4 or 5 years later, they decided to try to do the thing again. And by this time, the skittish guard birds had generated, because they were the younger birds. And so now the skittish ones were a new generation. And just by walking through with the hat on, the new generation recognized the danger and gave the signal. And they had never actually experienced the original danger at all. They had simply learned it from their parents and grandparents.
Wow. That is unbelievable. And yeah, it's exactly what we're talking about, right? This inherited trauma response, basically, right? That, like you said, they never experienced the originating event, but yet those crows still knew that that meant to flee, right? Because it's a protective mechanism. And what starts out as being a protective mechanism over time, though, again, over time can become culture. And over time, we actually start to recognize that, like, this is no longer helpful, right? It's sort of like when you're younger and mechanisms that you use to kind of basically protect yourself as a child, and then you grow up and those same sort of tools no longer function for you, right? And no longer work in the same way. It's a similar sort of phenomenon. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other?
There's a question in the chat.
Sorry. What's the response from people of color to encountering white people? Great question. So basically what Resma says is the response is actually similar, that we both actually have constriction and don't feel settled. We're talking about, again, he would say unknown white bodies or bodies of color, right? That once you get to know someone, that those factors start to mitigate, right? But we're talking about in the presence of an unknown white person or a person of color, right? And we're talking about involuntary responses. This is not something that we choose or would like. many times, that it just, again, because it's a trauma response, it occurs very quickly and it occurs without thought. And he would say it's actually similar. And so he actually recommends practices of learning to recognize constriction, settle the body. And he then goes on to, he has anchors that he would walk you through. And if that would be something you could actually get into if you wanted to do this book as a congregation, be really a wonderful thing. But he actually recommends those practices for both groups, but they also look different because white people, because we have had the power, have institutions and processes and practices that hold up this constriction and protect this constriction. And he talks about the fact that that's what white supremacy is. And that many times actually white people rely on people of color or Black people to actually soothe their sense of constriction or activation, and to make them feel better. And that he would say Black people will take that on, right? Black people buy into white supremacy, right? And he talks about the fact that, there's an article written by a Black male who's a lawyer, who says that when he's walking into his office building, that he will let white people go first and let them clear the lobby so they don't get agitated when he is standing in the lobby with them. Right. And he talks about the fact that when he's not wearing his business clothes and he's standing on a subway platform, he makes sure he doesn't stand too close to white people because he doesn't want to scare them. Right. And so in a sense, Black people have internalized this involuntary reaction that white people have and take it upon themselves to soothe Black people. And so what Resmaa is kind of just inviting both groups to do is to say we all need to learn to settle ourselves. We all need to learn to be aware of constriction, settle ourselves, so that we can deal with the ways that white supremacy has infiltrated our own culture and our own personal lives and our own families. And it's going to look different if you're a white person versus if you're a person of color. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions or comments?
You might be getting to this, but I'm curious, in that moment, what you walked us through took a bit of time to do.
Mm-hmm.
So is it a matter of incorporating that into our habitual practices, or are there things we can do in a quick moment that will help to get us back to that grounded place?
Right. So I'll speak from my own, Resmaa would say in his work that, the more that we do a practice like we did together today, the more that we're familiar with how to settle our bodies, like grounding our bodies, offering resource, breath, that we can then utilize that, right? When we're in those situations. But I like to actually speak about the fact that we can also there's some shortcuts that we can have when we find ourselves. So the first thing is always noticing, can we notice when we're reacting or constricting, right? Do we notice that your shoulder is starting to tighten up or your neck is starting to tighten up, or do you notice a tightness in your chest, right? So that's always the first step. Because if we can't notice it, then we're just going straight to reaction. So noticing is first. But then once we notice it, let's say we don't have time to sit down and do a little guided meditation, right? There are things that we can do in that moment to basically tell our bodies they're safe, right? So what's happening is our bodies are saying you are unsafe, right? And when we can notice that, we can then use our cognitive abilities and our own practices to say, actually, you are safe, right? And one of the ways we can do that is using the breath. So, and the Christian tradition, I like to say that the Christian tradition, I think, has known this as well throughout time. So we now know that if you elongate your exhale, this tells your body that you're okay, right? So when we are activated, we tend to breathe very quickly, right? Our heart rate increases and we breathe quickly. And you'll notice, even maybe when you get nervous, you start to breathe quickly or anxious. But if you can somehow elongate your exhale in that moment, your body knows that you're safe, right? And so one way to do that is to find ways to elongate your exhale. And one of the ways that I use is what I call very elegant breathing through a straw, right? So you breathe in through your nose, and then you breathe out like you're breathing through a straw, like you have a straw in front of your lips. And when you breathe in and then breathe out through a straw, you have to elongate your exhale, right? And so if we can somehow find ways to elongate that exhale, that allows us to come back into balance, right? To come back to ourselves. Another thing is, again, coming back into your body, right? So the very act of sort of what we did today was grounding, right? With slowing down. To basically, even if you're standing up, right, you can feel yourself standing, feel your feet grounding into the earth, allow yourself to accept that support, right? Feel yourself like being held by gravity, even just bringing your attention to that grounding, and allowing yourself to feel that. Or if you're sitting down, you can use your whole seat or your back, right? Feel yourself sitting. Can you tune into the sensations of yourself sitting? Can you feel the chair supporting you, right? That gets you back in your body, right? It gets you back to your body and allows you to start to settle your body, right? What we did together was offer a sense of support through self-touch. This can happen, you can do this anywhere, right? If you sense constriction in any part of your body, we actually can, we know that if you put your hand over that spot, whether it's your neck, right, or your chest, if you're feeling constriction in your chest, it actually offers you support. So you're actually offering yourself support in that moment. You're offering, it's basically a gesture of safety in that moment. And I think even utilizing some of our spiritual practices, like, many of you are probably familiar with centering prayer, right? Where, you can align that with your breath, and people will have mantras that they will take up and aligning that with their breath. And I think going into even a centering prayer in that moment is something that you can do to just, again, you're trying to settle your nervous system, right? To say you're actually not in danger right now, that you are safe. And so you're trying to tell your body, through your body, that you're safe. So those are a couple things, right, that we can do just in terms of tuning back into our bodies, coming back into our bodies to allow us to reconnect with safety, and to kind of settle our nervous systems.
Does the practice of yoga help with that breathing and settling?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yes, yoga is a great, is actually, it's well known to settle the nervous system, and to be a practice that brings us back. It brings you back into your body, right? Because when you're doing yoga and you're moving through those postures, that you are in your body, you're breathing with your body, you're moving with your body. But then also, it's been used in a lot of different treatments in terms of, it's used with people who have suffered from trauma, everything to, people who struggle with different types of addictions, because it's very settling. And it does those things that we're absolutely trying to do, right? To get back into our bodies, to settle the nervous system, and to provide that sort of grounding. So yeah, yoga is another way that's absolutely wonderful. And honestly, to tell one of my personal examples, I spoke earlier about getting into body work through my injury. It was actually yoga that brought me into it, because I started to realize I was having, headaches every single day, all day long. And I had always done yoga, but I had done it for exercise. And I realized when I did yoga, it helped my headaches. And I was like, well, this is so interesting, right? Like that yoga would help these post-concussive headaches. And that was actually something that brought me more into studying embodiment and how that interaction happens between body, mind, and spirit, and how important the body is for healing of all types. So yeah, thanks for that question.
I would say Kendi is critical of the idea that that trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Are you familiar with his critique of that?
I have heard that, but I would love for you to elaborate on it. Yeah.
I don't know that I can. I think he, that's as much as I understand of what his critique is. I mean, I think he just doesn't think it's so. He doesn't think that it's passed genetically, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would understand, knowing some of his work, I would understand why he would might be skeptical of that, because I mean, I think he's more of the looking at how our systems, I mean, that basically, you know, I think it would be too biological for him, that he really does not think that it's connected to biology. It's definite that it's been connected to systems of discrimination. And so I respect that, and I could see that. The reason I think I really appreciate this model of intergenerational trauma is because I do think there is something to the fact that white people and people of color too. I mean, I've talked with folks about this, that there is an involuntary aspect to responses, and I don't know if we necessarily understand why that is. And it may not just be intergenerational trauma; it could be many reasons. But I appreciate the fact that this gives us an explanation for that, and also an embodied way of approaching it. And it's not that I don't think we need cognitive and systemic and institutional analysis and reform and reparations and all of that, we do. But I also think that we need personal embodied work happening around it. And so I like the way those two are brought together in Resma's work. But I also can, I mean, some people would sort of say that they don't know. I mean, intergenerational trauma seems too out there, and, you know, do we really have the biology to support it? And I can respect that. But anyway, I find it important for the embodied aspect of racism. I find his argument important for that. So, but I'd be open to further conversation around that.
Makes me think of Jacqueline Woodson's novel Red at the Bone, which I just finished reading. There's a story of the Tulsa massacre that, whether or not it's genetically passed down, that story is definitely passed down from generation, and it influences people in whatever that mechanism is for passing that down. It's definitely influential, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. And I could see that too, like whether it's necessarily trauma or whether it's just stories or worldview or narratives, you know, that something is passed down that then influences us on this sort of like deeper embodied level. And I find resonance with that. And I think, you know, this is really interesting, right? I think there's a lot of different theories about what gets passed down in general, right? Like, is it narratological? Is it cultural? Is it institutional? Is it, you know, is it systemic? Is it biological? Is it a combination of all of these things? I can respect what Kendi is saying there. Sure, absolutely. But I also want to say, well, given all of that, you know, I do think it's really important to be doing embodied work alongside the cognitive work, because to sort of say like, well, then what does that look like if, regardless of how this got passed down, right? What does that look like for us to then address it here and now in these bodies, right? One of the things I kind of appreciate about the intergenerational trauma argument is that, you know, that trauma can be healed, you know, that trauma is not destiny, and that you can actually, if you can work through the pain of trauma, not to say, you know, magical heal, right? But that restoration and resilience can occur and do occur, and that you can then break cycles of trauma. And so through sort of both spiritual and psychological and embodied work. And so it sort of gives me a hope for like how we can, another way of approaching white supremacy alongside all of the ways that we have, right? To me, addressing it on as many levels as possible is really important.